Hello Internet, welcome back to Daily Codes, or welcome to Daily Codes if you're new. In the previous video on this tutorial series, we set up Airflow on the local machine and we set it up so that it can use SQLite. In this video, we are going to set up the database backend to be PostgresQL. So far, I have installed Postgres on my machine, and I expect you to have Postgres installed into your machine. The client that I'm using to interact with Postgres is called pgadmin. You can use any other client. The first thing we're going to do is to create the database that will be used by Postgres. So I'm going to create database, and I'm going to call this database Airflow tutorials. Then save. So I have Airflow tutorials database created here. The next thing I'm going to do is to check the version of this database. So right click here and I open query tool. Then I'm going to write here select version. The reason why I want to know the version of Postgres, this is version 14.1, is because Airflow has described the versions that Airflow supports. So Postgres version 11 to version 15 can work well with Airflow, and the version that I have on my machine is version 14.1. So that's good. We're going to be working with version 14.1. Then the next thing we're going to do is to create a schema that Airflow will be putting the metadata in. I don't prefer using public schema. I prefer descriptive schema for each of the projects that I'm working on. So we're going to create a new schema, and we're going to call this schema Airflow. So inside the Airflow tutorials database, there is a schema called Airflow. Then the next thing we're going to do is to create a user for Airflow. So for each of the projects that we are working on, or the projects that I work on, for each service, for example, Airflow as a service or any other data engineering service, I like creating the user for them so that I know who or what service is accessing the database. So in this case, we're going to create a user called Airflow user. So create user. I'm going to call this one my Airflow user with password, and the password of my Airflow user will be my Airflow password. So my underscore Airflow underscore pass. So let's create this user. So the user is created successfully, the role. Then the next thing we're going to do with the user is to grant privileges. So we're going to grant all privileges to the database that we've created. So we're going to say grant all privileges. Grant all privileges on database. And the database is Airflow tutorials. And we are granting all privileges on this database to the user. And the user we are granting these privileges to is my Airflow user. So we can run this. So the grant is successful. Then we have created this schema. We need the user to also have all privileges to this schema of Airflow. So we're going to say grant all privileges on schema, and the schema is Airflow schema to the user. So the user here is Airflow user, my Airflow user. Then let's run this. And this is the setup that we need for the user and the database. So we know that we have created a database called Airflow tutorials, and we have created a user called my Airflow user. The password for my Airflow user is my Airflow pass, and the user can access the database of Airflow tutorials and also can access the schema, Airflow schema. Then the next thing we're going to do is to access Postgres database, we need a package called psycopg. So you need to install psycopg on your machine. For Mac users, we'll need to install binary, but for the rest of PC users can install the real psycopg too. So I'm going to do pip install ps, that is psycopg 2, then binary. So this is going to help us interface so this is going to help us interface with Postgres database. Then the next thing we're going to do now is to set up in the config file for Airflow. We're going to set up the config for SQL Alchemy connection to connect to the database. So I'm going to launch my VS Code from here. Let me maximize this, make it bigger. So in this file here, we have several environment definitions for environment variables for Airflow. So one of them is SQL Alchemy connection. So we're going to look for it. So SQL, yeah, here is SQL Alchemy connection. So this should be equal to, I'm going to comment out this line, then I'm going to define a new connection. This line was for the SQLite database that we saw in the previous video, but now we don't want to use SQLite because it's not recommended. It's not a recommended database to be used in production. So we're going to use SQL. We're going to use Postgres database. So here we're going to define the connection, and we're going to say we're going to use Postgres. So we're going to use Postgres SQL and interface it with the psycopg 2. Then the user is Airflow user. It's my Airflow user, so we're going to have the user here, copy and paste it here. Then at password, the user, then colon password, sorry. The password is my Airflow pass. Then on localhost, let me reduce the size of this. So SQL Alchemy. So SQL Alchemy connection, and we are interfacing the Airflow. So SQL Alchemy connection, and we are interfacing Airflow with Postgres using psycopg 2. and my user is Airflow user. The password of Airflow user is my Airflow pass, and the database is on the local host. Then the name of the database is going to be Airflow tutorials. Next, we are going to define the schema. Remember, we created this schema here to be used by Airflow. We don't want Airflow to use the public schema. So we are going to define the schema that Airflow is going to use here. So we're going to search for a variable called schema, SQL Alchemy schema, and the schema is going to be Airflow. So Airflow. And that is how we define the schema. Then we save this file. Remember, this file, we got it inside the folder for Airflow home. The moment you run Airflow version, like you saw in the previous video, it creates all these files, and one of the files is the Airflow config file, and it's the one that we have been updating. Then the next thing we're going to do now is to create the user again, because we are now using a different database. The previous user that we created was in the SQLite database, and now we want to create the user in the Postgres database. Before we create the user, let's first initialize the database. Before we initialize it, again, we have to look at Airflow schema and look at the tables, and we can see that we don't have any table. So when we do Airflow init db, it's going to create all the necessary metadata tables inside our database. So we have an error here, and it's saying group command. Which command did I write here? Oh, it's supposed to be Airflow db init. Right, so if we look at our tables now, let me refresh these schemas. Then let's look at the tables. We can see that all the metadata tables are created here. You can play with them, query them if you want, but for now we need to create a user. So I'm going to write Airflow users create. Then the username is Dali. The first name is Dali. Then the last name is Codes. The email is dali@codes.com. Then the role is admin. The password, we shall type the password. Let's run that. Password Dali codes 123, Dali codes 123. The password is created. So we have created the user. One last thing that we need to do so that it doesn't throw warnings is to change the executor to local executor from sequential. So I'm going to look for executor here. Executor. There's so many. Let me just write executor equals to, yeah. So here we have sequential executor. We are going to change it into local executor. Sequential executor is not advisable to use in production. I don't know why. We will find out as the tutorials go on. But the local executor is preferable, or the Kubernetes executor. Mostly sequential executor executes tasks sequentially, and it may cause a lot of backlog when you're running your tasks. And then these other ones are written so that they can run tasks in parallel. So we have this executor, then let's save, and then we have now two windows. As from the previous video, we know that one of the terminals here is for running the scheduler, and the other terminal is for running the web server. So let me run the scheduler here. Then let me run the web server here. So Airflow web server. So web server is running on localhost at that port. Let's go to our browser and try to access it. So our user is Dali. Then the password is Dali codes 123. Sign in. And voila, now we have a clean interface for Airflow. So this is how you set up Airflow to use Postgres database in the back end. In the next video, we shall look at Airflow user interface themes, the themes for this. We have this theme, but we have several other themes. Subscribe and hit the notification button to be alerted when I upload the next video for the themes. Until then, take care.